welcome to the latest podcast of AUK. Today we're taking a look at the British way of life, because we are now a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-faith community, so there are many influences pulling in different directions. So perhaps we need to define what we mean by the British way of life. Is it a Miss Marple village society, guys?
No, I mean, I think this is a big problem. There's a sort of mythological idea that there is something that we all agree on as the British way of life or traditional values. And I don't think we do. I think lots of us think of different things or different emphases when we're looking at that sort of general idea.
Yeah, we don't want to split up into ghettos, though, do we, really?
Well, the British way of life definitely changes over historical time. It's different to what it was when we were born. Which is itself very different to what it was in Victorian times, which was different to what it was in medieval times. I think, as an atheist society, what we're looking at is the British way of life in terms of religion and how far it is now diverging from the traditional religions, or both indigenous to Britain, which is Christianity, and from other world religions, some of which are themselves changing a lot in practice.
Yeah, and I think this in October next month we're going to get the census figures from 2021. Now that's going to be interesting to see how much further, hopefully further, non-religious belief has made an inroad into British society. And the more that it does so, the more we can turn around and say to government, it really is time to disestablish the church and to remove all these minority religious interests out of public ceremonies and public thinking, and remove the privilege that these people are given in Parliament and elsewhere.
Absolutely. Norman, you've lived a long life like me. Have you seen any changes?
Well, just commenting on what Guy just said, we are a quasi-secular society, but technically we still have the king who has been anointed with holy oil, whatever that is. I would like to know what exactly they use for the holy oil, but this apparently comes from God and gives him a special status. So
if it comes
from quasi-secular society at the moment.
If it comes from God, it's obviously 3-in-1 oil.
Well,
I like it.
He is yet to be anointed, so perhaps he's not a proper king as yet. I think he's acting with all the powers, whether anointed or not. But I think a further point is worth making. And although it is important in the census that so many people will declare themselves non-believers, it has been building up for a long time before it was ever declared. I mean, even when I was young, it was a minority who were going to church every Sunday. Whereas if we go back to the pre-war times, it might well have been a majority, and certainly in Victorian times. So the first step was, well, we won't bother to go to church, even if we're not declaring we're no longer a believer. And then having become accustomed now to not going to church, and with the new generations coming, they're saying, well, they don't believe anyhow, which is just making explicit a situation which has been developing for a long time.
Yeah. So are there any sort of core values or foundational principles that we would like to say are part of the British way of life?
Modern British way of life. Because that's very different to what it was centuries ago. It's in the proposed letter to MPs. I've picked out some points with respect to religion or irreligion, and really to contrast it with what is happening in Islam, because it's traditional, and most Islamists or Muslims would disagree with every one of those. Social tolerance, we're tolerant of let's say, different lifestyles, whether it be religion, whether it be in terms of marriage, intellectual free expression. Now, I suppose many religions weren't keen on that, but it's explicitly forbidden to criticize religion in Islam. Democracy. Now that's very different into it's compatible with Christianity, but it's very different to Islam, where the religious and the civil leadership are one and the same.
Yeah.
Ideally, for Muslims, it's leadership by their priests. But more traditionally, it was leadership by a king, not by democracy. And he personally ruled on what was acceptable and proper in Islam and what was not. An equivalence of rights between men and women. Now, I mentioned that rather than non-racism, because the religions, and none of them are that explicitly racist, and the ones which are more so see their followers as a chosen people, as to the Jews and the Hindus, but not quite as explicitly. And certainly Christianity and Islam want to convert everybody, and they're not concerned about race. But the real difference in religion is between men and women.
Yeah. They're all misogynist, aren't they?
I highlight rejection of violent behavior, which is very much in contrast to jihad, which is an Islamic doctrine, although it's much exaggerated by fundamentalist Muslims today.
I can go along with all of that.
Yeah. I mean, I think traditional British values are probably encapsulated in the Human Rights Convention quite well. And that, of course, does not mention monarchy, so or indeed established religion. But I think that the interesting point about your letter is that our society has been very weak in defending the fundamental freedoms from encroachment by especially Muslims, but others as well, who want to close down cinemas or debates or cultural phenomena that express, that are expressions of freedom and are critical of their way of life. I think we've got to get to the point where our politics is robust enough to actually defend freedom.
Yes,
it is at the moment, and hopefully the expansion of our non-religious citizenry, and especially atheist and citizenry, will contribute to a bit of backbone and spine amongst politicians.
Yes. So what we're saying is religious practices should not be permitted to conflict with our humanitarian principles.
And our atheist principles.
Very much so. But the problem is in politics is the interest groups. I mean, the Muslims have such a big say in Labour, and Labour is so dependent on Muslim votes that they're not prepared to do anything against that minority. I mean, it's because the votes swing on it. It's a bit like the abortion issue, in that those who were against abortion had some pull, not so much because they were a majority, but because that was an issue that would influence their votes. And it's very hard to overcome that, especially if the party which is dependent on their votes is in power. As it happens, in very few Muslims and ever fewer Muslims are voting for the Conservatives. So perhaps now is the time to push, because some of them.
Jeffrey, we can see more and more Muslims voting Conservative, and look at them, the Muslims who are near the top of the Conservative party, and some of them are in government. I think that shows that actually the Tories have a very broad Islamic support.
Well, one thing we don't.
Can I comment on that? It's not really true. I think there were only 3 Muslim Conservative MPs, and it's also true that those who are conservative, and certainly the conservative representatives amongst the Muslim communities, are overwhelmingly drawn from the most moderate Muslims, often the secular ones, and certainly the Muslims who are at least fundamentalist. I think Boris Johnson drove off practically half the 20% of Muslims who had previously voted conservative. So, and also, it's true that a lot more Hindus are now voting conservative, and it has become a much more defined split between how Hindus vote and how Muslims vote.
Yeah. What we don't want to happen is for the parties to line up with their respective religions, like is the case in America, where you have it's clear that the Republicans have a Christian base.
Yeah, so, certainly the Jews appear to be moving towards the Tories at the moment in Manchester, anyway.
And in America, they're moving towards the Democrats.
Bizarre, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, well, there you go. So anyway, the government has tried to do stuff to make our society more coherent, haven't they? One of the things they did was they set up an anti-Muslim hatred working group, anti-Muslim hatred working group. And the deputy chair of this group was a guy called Karim Azim, MBE, who was also the imam of Makkah Masjid Mosque in Leeds. That was, on the face of it, that seemed like a good idea, you know.
It was, if I remember rightly, and I did write to MPs years ago about it, protesting about the membership, a working group about Sharia, when David Cameron, at the end of his tenure, managed to see sense and became alarmed about what was happening amongst the Muslim communities and how they were dominating over their women. And so he set up this Sharia inquiry into the effects of Sharia, which was sabotaged by one Theresa May, who made, apart from putting people who were religious, both Christian and Muslim, onto the working party, it then sabotaged it by making its only advisors its two imams, supposedly tame imams, instead of people who from outside the Muslim community who would put in a more objective and fairer perspective on it.
Yeah, and indeed, as events proved, that particular imam, Qari Azim, blotted his copybook when he supported a campaign to limit free expression about the protesting the screening of the film The Lady of Heaven, which is about Prophet Muhammad's daughter. I don't think many of us were surprised that he did that, but what he actually said on Facebook was, I quote, "We have been working with many brothers and imams across the country to liaise with the cinemas. Some imams have taken a view to protest, and others are in dialogue with the cinemas trying to resolve the situation. In some places, we have been successful, and those cinemas will no longer be showing the movie." And he advertised a protest in Leeds with details of its timing and location. So,
and it is worth. It's now we're speaking about the British way of life, contrasting with that with what happened with a film about Christianity, The Life of Brian, over 40 years ago, where a minority of, let's say, fervent Christians tried to stop that being screened, and they met with next to no success. And a few local authorities did ban it. But it was so easy to go into another neighbouring local authority which was showing it.
Yes.
And it's very disturbing that a minority, basically immigrant group, and foreign religion can have the sort of impact 40 years on, which even the mainstream Christianity failed to have 40 years ago.
Yeah.
It shows how much we are pandering to with this strident minority.
they were successful.
Norman wants to say something.
Can I just say that we shouldn't be too critical of the Muslims when we consider they're only 1,400 years old. They celebrated their 14th century, I think, just this year, because Christianity has been going for over 2,000 years, and it's time to get a bit more moderate and reasonable. So when we think what Christianity was like when it was in AD 1400, it wasn't that marvelous. They could still burn people at the stake and drown witches and goodness knows what, all sorts of horrible things. So perhaps the Muslims won't take another 600 years to become a little bit more reasonable. Let's hope.
I trust you're being facetious, because the Sikhs are only 500 years old, and we're not going to wait 1,500 years for them to become sensible.
Well, I'm not prepared to wait 5 years, I'm afraid.
Yeah, well, of course, today is the day of the rapture, so we may all be disappearing anyway shortly. But I mean, the bad news for Muslims is actually Islam wasn't really created until the 8th century, so that they're 100 years out. They're only 1,300 years old. And I mean, that's pretty well established now by independent researchers, people like Thomas Alexander, who's got plenty of YouTubes, and I do recommend readers have a look at those, because the traditional Islamic account of their origins is completely fabricated.
Well, we know that all the books were destroyed and they started again. We do know that. So that was 1,300 years ago, was it? Anyway,
it's in the middle of the 8th century, in the 700s AD.
Yeah. So this particular protest that the Muslims carried out against the movie was successful, because Cineworld cancelled all UK screenings. So we don't want that, do we? We don't think that religious communities should be allowed to impose their standards on the population at large.
Well, we definitely should be pleased that we've got rid finally of the law about blasphemy, because certainly the whole notion of blasphemy is a very peculiar one, which I don't think we believe in at all, of course. And that is the reason in which they claim that they can't have this or they can't have that, because it's blasphemous.
Yes.
So I'm glad we've got rid of that one.
Well, I mean, the trouble is that the police seem to now to be able to arrest people just for holding up a blank sheet of paper, and you think, goodness sakes, you know, they don't need blasphemy. They can arrest you for anything, whatever they feel like, by the looks of it.
It's very worrying. Anyway,
when it comes to blasphemy, I think it's worth making the point that blasphemy is supposed to be against God. And what the Muslims are claiming is that criticizing Muhammad, who even they recognize was just a man, and is somehow blasphemous. I mean, in Christianity, Christ was a manifestation of God. They're not making that claim and never have about Muhammad, and yet they somehow claim that criticizing their messenger, their mere man, is somehow blasphemy, when blasphemy, even when it existed, was supposed to be reserved for God.
Yes,
it's completely irrational.
It reminds me of that story about the headmaster who's telling off a pupil, saying, "What your conduct is displeasing to God, and what is more, it is displeasing to me."
Well, of course, we know that every believer chooses a God that agrees with them. Anyway, the unfortunate imam was sacked as a result of his campaign to limit free expression, which I think you'll agree is a good thing. He's no longer in an advisory position.
But he should never have been appointed in the first place.
Probably not.
But then they can't find any imam who is moderate enough to go along with the government line.
Well, they should appoint some of these independent, free-thinking Muslim women.
Without their headscarves on, yes.
Yeah.
So, but the government has done some other things in trying to foster the British way of life. And one of which we're actually using as a campaign, because they've asked councils to select areas that are deemed to be at risk of antisocial behaviour that might disrupt the neighbourhood.
Yes.
And what they've done is they've required landlords in those areas to bear responsibility for not stopping their tenants from causing such problems. And they're making the landlords liable to fines, sanctions, and banning orders if they fail in this endeavour. I think that's pretty outrageous. What do you say?
Yeah. Well, it is outrageous. Actually, they've allowed councils rather than asked councils to do so. It also stems from a different problem, which isn't at all religious. What used to happen was that the worst behaviour was usually confined to the big council estates where people rented from the council. Increasingly, people have bought the council or houses off the council, so that they put pressure on in that way and got their neighbours to behave because they own the assets, and that has somewhat improved the council estates, and the renting in turn has gone to private landlord areas, to streets. It's where previously there was little or no renting, and some of the bad behaviours come with that. And obviously the owner occupiers who own their own homes and have a vested interest because of the prices of their own homes and the desirability of the neighbourhood are very annoyed with this bad behaviour, which is happening now to a degree, although not as much on the council estate still, but had not happened before. Yes, and the politicians, and some of them have picked up on that. I think it's outrageous. But what we're asking, in any case, is it's for a lot less from the religious organisations. They seem to think that any general bad behaviour should be controlled by landlords. I don't see how it's really feasible, because the tenants are paying the landlords. It's not the landlords paying the tenants. So he who pays has the whip hand anyhow. So
I mean, surely it's incredibly wrong in principle.
Or should do about that. But what we're asking really is that the mosques and other cults, their religious buildings and the religious leadership should be stopping their adherents from misbehaving in a way inspired by their religion, by their doctrines, which they are preaching at the mosques. And we're saying they've got to fit in with what is happening and what is reasonable to the outside community in terms of their behaviour that is inspired by religion. We're not asking them to stop their congregants from stealing cars or just being criminal. We're asking them to stop the congregants waging jihad or citing their religion as a reason to stop the free expression of other people.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. I think we can expect them to maintain and not to promote and preach jihad, homophobia, and inequality of the sexes. These kind of things. I think we must expect in a secular society, a society that has human rights as sort of standard. We can't allow these religious bodies to undermine these basic human values, which I think we can promote as British values.
Yes, and it's particular that they've singled out landlords as if they're responsible for what happens under their roof.
Yeah, that's surely wrong in principle. The idea that that a landlord should try to enforce some particular point of view from their tenants is, I mean, it's contrary to all freedoms. For goodness sakes, I mean, they're already having to buy their home space from somebody. That's bad enough. But the fact that if they then have to abide by some code of belief system imposed by the landlord, that's surely wrong.
Norman, you want to say something about this?
Well, just to echo that it's a very patronising idea that the landlord has to supervise the tenants' private opinions on matters. No, I think that's not right. It's too patronising, really.
Yeah. It's not as if the landlords are trying to impose some sort of doctrine or ideology on their tenants, is it?
Yeah. No.
But imams do exactly that. So we're missing the target here. We're firing. Our bullets are going off target. So
yeah, I mean, not only imams, but I mean, especially religious, extreme religious groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses and Plymouth Brethren, and
exactly
a few other groups. The way they discipline their flock is such as to be pretty authoritarian and almost amount to control, I think.
Yes.
Yes, I am very concerned about what they're doing within their own communities, forcing dress, forcing behaviour. I mean, I think what happened in Ireland with the Magdalene laundries was a scandal, and it should have been picked up at the time. But it's many times worse, which is what is happening within Muslim communities. And to some extent, some other minority religions, the religious Jews, and a few other very small sects in Britain today. And that should not be permissible within Britain for one person to control the behaviour of another, especially amongst adults.
So we'd like our viewers to know that AUK is writing to all the MPs, pointing out the outrageousness, the inconsistency, the ridiculousness of this singling out of landlords for policies that they can't be expected to enhance, to be responsible for, and inviting them to join us in looking at extending their British way of life desires to organisations which have congregations under their roof, but they try to incite violence from.
Yeah, and that's a far worse problem. And we're not going to be quite as explicit when we write to MPs about what they should or should not do with respect to landlords. We're just saying that's what they are doing. Yes. And it's much more important that they do something about these religious fanatics arising from religious buildings and take control of that situation.
Exactly. Hit the target, guys. So,
it's worth pointing out that we're not suggesting that, and it would be difficult to do it, but a lot of Muslim countries, such as Tunisia, license their imams. So if they don't have a license, they're not allowed to preach in any mosque in a lot of Muslim countries.
Well, the Church of England has a system of licensing vicars and preachers. They'll do it.
There's more independence than this from the state licensing in Muslim countries, because there's quite a lot of independence in the Church of England system.
That's a subject for another podcast. How do you get to be a clergyman? In a lot of countries, you just announce that you are.
In Britain, you do. Reverend Ian Paisley announced his own sect.
Yes, that's right. Yes. On that note, thanks very much, guys. Hope you've enjoyed it as much as me.